Let's talk about a historic groundbreaking happening here in South Florida. It's an Everglades restoration project known as Blue Shanty Flowway.
Not because the soil was soft, but because there was nothing beneath it. The tunnels went down, sometimes 4 feet, sometimes 6, sometimes deeper. When survey teams ran camera probes into the passages, they found interconnected burrow systems stretching for hundreds of linear feet beneath a single section of marsh. The subsurface architecture that should have been holding the wetland together, the root systems, the layered peat, the compressed organic soil, had been eaten away from within. The culprit was already in the mud, armored catfish, using their powerful mouths and heavily built bodies to excavate burrows for shelter, for breeding, and for surviving the dry season conditions that periodic drawdowns create. The burrows themselves weren't just a curiosity. They were destroying the structural foundation of the marsh. Native plants couldn't reestablish because the soil beneath them was riddled with voids. Water didn't flow the way it should because the subsurface topography had been fundamentally altered. In the most affected sections, scientists estimated that more than half of the subsurface structure in some zones had been compromised. The marsh wasn't just struggling ecologically. It was physically sinking. And something much larger had been using those burrow systems too. South Florida's Burmese python crisis is not news. Scientists, conservationists, and wildlife managers have been sounding alarms about the species for more than 2 decades. First sightings in Everglades National Park occurred in the 1980s, likely from pets released by owners who underestimated how large the snakes would grow. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 reportedly destroyed at least one python breeding facility, releasing additional animals. By 2000, multiple generations of wild pythons were already established in the park. The numbers since then have grown into something that defies easy comprehension. The U.S. Geological Survey, as recently as March 2025, confirmed that conservatively, tens of thousands of invasive Burmese pythons are now present in the greater Everglades region. Some researchers have suggested the true population could be far higher, possibly in the hundreds of thousands, though the snake's extraordinary ability to remain invisible makes any estimate uncertain. A 2024 study published in the Journal of Coastal Research modeled exponential population growth projections that produced numbers ranging from hundreds of thousands to potentially millions within a few years under certain conditions, though the authors acknowledge those models likely overestimated growth by not accounting for density-dependent factors. What makes the python so difficult to fight is precisely what makes it so successful. As the USGS has noted, Burmese pythons are a highly cryptic species. Their camouflage is near perfect in the Everglades environment. Their movement and dispersal patterns are poorly understood. They spend much of their lives invisible, either in dense vegetation or, as drainage operations have increasingly revealed, underground. Burmese pythons are known to use underground burrows during periods of temperature stress, a behavior called brumation, a reptilian equivalent of hibernation, retreating into warm subsurface chambers to wait out cold snaps, or, researchers now believe, using established tunnel networks as permanent infrastructure for hunting, resting, and reproduction. A 2025 USGS report documented trail camera evidence of pythons using a concrete pipe as a nesting site, with researchers measuring temperatures inside the nest to study the snake's brooding behavior. The paper, authored by Curillo and others, represented the first complete documentation of egg-laying and brooding behavior recorded over a full time period for a female Burmese python in the wild. It confirmed that these snakes aren't simply drifting through the landscape. They are establishing homes. When drainage operations pull water away from vast sections of formerly flooded marsh, they do something that aerial surveys and radio telemetry programs can never fully replicate. They expose the subsurface. And what teams have found in those exposed moments has repeatedly rewritten what scientists thought they knew about how pythons are using the Everglades. Burrow systems with multiple chambers. Shed skins deep underground. Bone fragments from previous meals scattered through the passages. Evidence, in short, of long-term, repeated habitation, not transient shelter, but established residence. The ecological consequences of the python's presence are already catastrophic in measurable ways. A peer-reviewed study published in the journal Neobiota in 2022, drawing on data from over 4,000 wild Burmese pythons removed from southern Florida over 26 years, confirmed that the species has driven local declines of more than 90% in mesomammal populations, the medium-sized animals that form a critical link in the Everglades food chain. Raccoons, possums, marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, foxes, species that were once common and widespread across the region, have effectively disappeared from many surveyed areas. As wildlife ecologist Frank Mazzotti of the University of Florida, who has studied Everglades wildlife for over 3 decades, has noted, those mammals that once appear by the roadside every 100 meters in Everglades National Park simply began to vanish in the early 2000s. The python was the culprit. The removal of that prey base doesn't just affect the python. It destabilizes every predator that ever relied on those species. Bobcats, great horned owls, red-tailed hawks, all of them now compete for a shrinking food supply in areas where pythons reign. The ripple effects move up and across the food web in ways that scientists are still working to fully trace. During drainage events, with water retreating and prey species trapped in shrinking pools, the predator concentration becomes visible in ways that are genuinely difficult to believe. Alligators, drawn by the distress signals of packed fish and the smell of dying animals, converge on depressions in numbers that seasoned field researchers describe as unprecedented. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, packing into pools no larger than a tennis court. Wading birds descend from miles away. What results is a simultaneous feeding frenzy and ecological massacre, visible, concentrated, chaotic, that reveals in miniature what has been happening across vast areas of the ecosystem in slow motion for years. If the biological discoveries were alarming, the chemistry was worse. When wetland sediment is exposed to open air after years of submersion, a chemical clock begins ticking. Organic matter that has been accumulating on the bottom, dead plant material, animal waste, agricultural residue carried in on the water, begins to oxidize. Compounds that were locked in place under anaerobic conditions suddenly become mobile. And in the Everglades context, the compound that matters most is phosphorus. The Everglades agricultural area, the vast sugarcane growing zone that sits immediately north of the stormwater treatment systems, has been contributing phosphorus-laden runoff to the surrounding water system for decades. The phosphorus accumulates not just in the water column but in the sediment itself, building up year after year in layers that the STAs are designed to capture but cannot fully neutralize. When those sediments are exposed, they don't hold their chemistry. They release it. According to the Friends of the Everglades 2026 report and the South Florida Water Management District's own annual South Florida Environmental Report, phosphorus concentrations flowing from the stormwater treatment areas into the protected Everglades are rising, not falling, in the 2024 to 2025 water year. This was true across multiple STAs. The legally mandated limit, established through decades of Clean Water Act litigation that Friends of the Everglades successfully pursued, is a concentration of no more than 13 parts per billion in 3 out of 5 water years. The agricultural runoff concentrations entering the system from Everglades agricultural area farms, according to a peer-reviewed study in PMC, averaged over 74 micrograms per liter across a 20-year study period and in some cases reached nearly 270 micrograms per liter, numbers many times higher than what the treatment systems were ever designed to handle. What this means in practical terms is that every time a treatment area is drained for maintenance and then refilled, it functions like squeezing a sponge. The sediment releases its accumulated burden of nutrients into the water column. That nutrient surge travels south with the refill. And when phosphorus at elevated concentrations hits the oligotrophic, naturally low nutrient waters of the protected Everglades, the consequences are documented and predictable. Cyanobacteria bloom. Toxin levels spike. Fish populations crash. The system that has been described as a filter is, during drainage events, temporarily functioning as a pump, sending exactly the pollution it was meant to remove straight into the ecosystem it was designed to protect. The 2021 Piney Point disaster provided a visible, catastrophic example of what phosphorus-loaded water can do when it overwhelms a coastal system. Engineers released hundreds of millions of gallons of contaminated water from a failing storage facility to prevent a structural collapse. The nutrient surge triggered toxic algae blooms along Florida's Gulf Coast. An estimated 1,500 tons of marine life died. Dolphins, manatees, and sea turtles washed ashore. Tourism revenues collapsed. The economic damage ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. That event involved a single site, a single discharge, a discrete crisis. What scientists are now grappling with in the Everglades is the cumulative, low-level, ongoing version of that same process, slower, harder to see, and far more extensive in scale. In the list of alarming discoveries that drainage operations in South Florida's wetlands have produced in recent years, the island apple snail has received the least public attention and deserves considerably more. The island apple snail, Pomatia maculata, arrived in Florida in the 1980s and early 1990s, most likely as an aquarium species released into canals and waterways by hobbyists who no longer wanted their pets. It has since spread across freshwater ponds, swamps, and canals from South Carolina and Georgia down through Florida and into the Everglades system, according to the Smithsonian Institution's Invasive Species Database. The snails are large, growing to the size of a golf ball or larger, and their bright, distinctive egg clutches, deposited in masses of pink or coral-colored beads above the waterline, have become an increasingly common sight on vegetation along Florida's waterways. A 2023 University of Florida study published by UF/EFOS researchers provided the first systematic look at the ecological impact of Pomatia maculata on Florida's wetland environments and concluded that the snails are capable of fundamentally altering the ecological structure of the wetland they colonize. They consume aquatic vegetation faster than it can regenerate in some conditions. They compete aggressively with the native Florida apple snail for the same ecological niche. And where they dominate, the birds and animals that depend on native snail populations, including the iconic snail kite, already listed as an endangered species, are forced to adapt or decline. But the ecological threat is not even the most urgent concern. As South Florida wildlife officials warned in August 2024, island apple snails are a documented vector for the rat lungworm parasite Angiostrongylus canadensis. This nematode naturally parasitizes rodents, but when humans accidentally ingest infected snails, snail mucus, or vegetation contaminated by infected snails, the larvae can migrate to the human central nervous system and cause a condition called eosinophilic meningitis, a potentially fatal inflammation of the lining of the brain. A 2024 study published in the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases documented detection of rat lungworm larvae in invasive apple snails collected in Georgia, confirming geographic expansion of the parasite and the snail's role as an intermedia host. The parasite was first recorded in Florida in 2013 and has been spreading steadily since. During drainage operations that expose the banks and vegetation of stormwater treatment areas, biologists have documented massive clusters of apple snail eggs across the exposed surfaces, thousands of clutches adhering to dead plant stems, exposed roots, and debris lines left by the receding water. Each egg clutch contains hundreds of individual eggs. The scale of reproductive output concentrated in a single treatment area during a drainage event is, by any measure, staggering. When the water returns and the vegetation grows back, those eggs hatch, the juveniles disperse, and a new generation of invasive snails spreads further into the system. No single species discovered during these drainage operations exists in isolation. They are part of a broader pattern that makes South Florida arguably the most heavily invaded continental ecosystem in the United States, a distinction that carries devastating ecological implications. According to research led by Chris Searcy, an associate professor of biology at the University of Miami, who has spent years mapping invasive species distribution across South Florida, the region hosts more non-native species than any other continental area in the country. When Searcy's team conducted surveys in urban parks in Miami, 93% of the reptiles and amphibians they observed were non-native. In native habitats like the Everglades, the percentage is lower, but the damage is far more severe, because native species in those environments have no evolutionary experience with the predators and competitors that have arrived. Searcy's research, published in the Annual Review of Ecology, Evolution, and Systematics, traced the ecological pathways that allow invasive species to penetrate native habitats more easily than previously understood. One of the key findings was counterintuitive. Wetlands, which might seem like protected, difficult-to-access environments, are not as resistant to invasion as scientists once hoped. Certain species, particularly those that evolved as wetland specialists in their native ranges, have proven highly capable of establishing in South Florida's remaining marshes. When they do, the impacts are disproportionate. The Asian swamp eel, another invasive species that has established populations in South Florida's waterways, has been identified as a significant predator of native amphibians. Searcy's lab launched a study in 2025, funded by the South Florida Water Management District, specifically to determine which non-native fish species are the worst predators for native amphibians. Research prompted in part by documented declines of roughly 80% in Everglades amphibian populations between 1996 and 2019. That is not a modest decline. That is a near-total collapse of an entire vertebrate class across one of the most ecologically important wetland systems in the Western Hemisphere. A 2024 Sierra Club report highlighted an irony that has become increasingly central to how scientists think about Everglades restoration. The multi-billion-dollar effort to restore the Everglades, which involves plugging old drainage canals and rerouting water to replenish the marshes, has in some cases created new problems. The deep ponds formed when drainage canals are plugged provide ideal overwintering habitat for non-native fish, allowing them to survive cold snaps that would otherwise limit their populations. And when restoration water flows are re-established to push freshwater south through the system, those non-native fish ride the current, spreading further into the ecosystem with each new restoration pulse. The system designed to fix the damage is, in some cases, accelerating the spread of the very species that are compounding that damage. To fully understand what drainage operations are revealing, you have to go back to the beginning of the problem, not the recent past, but the foundational decisions that made the modern Everglades crisis possible. Before drainage efforts began in the 1880s, the Everglades covered roughly 4,000 square miles of southern Florida, according to historical analyses. By the time the 1948 Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project was complete, a federal engineering program that built 1,000 miles of canals, 720 miles of levees, and 150 water control structures, the Everglades had been effectively cut in half. More than 1 million acres of functioning wetland are converted to agricultural and urban use within 2 decades. The engineering was celebrated as a triumph of human control over nature. The ecological consequences were catastrophic and, for decades, largely ignored. The sediment left behind in the surviving wetlands carries the chemical signature of that century of exploitation. Phosphorus concentrations in the accumulated muck of old agricultural areas can be orders of magnitude above the levels the native ecosystem can tolerate. Pesticides banned in the 1970s, organochlorines, DDT metabolites, chlordane, persist in the deepest layers of some sediment profiles, held in place by the anaerobic conditions beneath the water. When drainage operations expose that sediment, those compounds don't simply evaporate. They oxidize. They immobilize. They move. What restoration scientists have come to recognize is that every drainage operation in these treatment areas is simultaneously a management action and a geological excavation, a controlled release of the chemical legacy of decisions made by engineers and politicians who have been dead for decades. The water going south during the refill cycle after a drawdown is not the same water that went in. It carries history. This is the weight that sits beneath the optimistic language of restoration progress reports and funding announcements. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, authorized in 2000 and representing the largest ecosystem restoration effort in United States history, is a genuine and scientifically grounded attempt to undo a century of damage. It involves more than 60 major projects. It is funded at billions of dollars over multiple cycles. It coordinates more than a dozen federal and state agencies. And it faces a challenge that cannot be solved simply by rerouting water or building reservoirs, because the invasive species, the chemical legacy, and the structural damage to the wetland fabric itself continue to compound faster than any single restoration strategy can address. And yet, buried in all of this, there is something that genuine scientists, people who have spent careers measuring decline, describe with something approaching. The Everglades remembers what it was. Research published by wetland ecologists studying controlled drawdown operations at multiple restoration sites has documented a phenomenon that surprised even the scientists conducting the work. When drainage protocols are designed to mimic the natural dry season patterns that the Everglades evolved with, gradual, predictable, tied to seasonal rhythms, the native vegetation doesn't need to be replanted. It sprouts on its own. Seed banks dormant in the soil for decades, in some cases since before the 1948 drainage project, fundamentally alter the hydrology, retain the ability to germinate when conditions finally return to something approximating what the ecosystem once sustained. Native sawgrass and spike rush pushing up through exposed mud in areas that had been dominated by invasive vegetation for years. Native crayfish and grass shrimp returning to recovering zones, forming the base of the food web that, when it functions, cascades upward through the entire system, drawing wading birds back to nest, stabilizing alligator populations, restoring the biological rhythms that make the Everglades one of the most productive subtropical wetland systems on Earth. The USGS has been applying what drainage operations reveal, specifically the mapping of python burrow systems exposed during low water conditions, to build predictive models for where denning populations are most likely concentrated. New radio tracking technology mounted on small unmanned aircraft systems is being tested in the complex Everglades habitat to locate pythons more efficiently and safely. In 2024, USGS researchers formally documented python consumption rates for white-tailed deer in Big Cypress National Preserve, adding to the growing body of data needed to design effective removal strategies. Florida's annual Python Challenge, which grew significantly in 2024 with prize money reaching up to $25,000 for the longest and most snakes caught, represents the public face of a removal effort that is far more methodical and data-driven behind the scenes. Wildlife managers are not simply hunting pythons. They are using what drainage surveys reveal about underground infrastructure to plan strategic removals in areas where denning populations are most concentrated, trying to get ahead of the breeding season before water levels rise and the snakes disappear again. The question that hangs over every drainage operation, every soil chemistry report, every python extraction, and every apple snail survey is the same question that has hung over the Everglades for the better part of a century. Does the political will exist to match the scientific understanding? The science is not uncertain. Researchers across the University of Florida, the University of Miami, Florida Atlantic University, the USGS, the South Florida Water Management District, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and numerous other institutions have spent decades building a detailed, evidence-based picture of what is wrong and what is needed. The stormwater treatment areas need more land to treat the phosphorus load they receive. The python population needs sustained, systematic, well-funded removal programs with tools better than what currently exist. The invasive plant and fish species need targeted, coordinated management strategies that account for the ways restoration water flows spread them. And the underlying hydrology, the slow seasonal sheet flow of fresh water moving south through a living, breathing landscape, needs to be restored to something closer to its natural rhythm. None of this is free. The current comprehensive restoration effort is funded at approximately $2.4 billion over the active funding cycle, according to project documents. It involves coordination across more than 16 federal and state agencies. It requires sustained political pressure to maintain funding appropriations against competing priorities. And it operates in a state where the agricultural industry that is responsible for a significant portion of the phosphorus pollution is also one of the most politically influential interest groups in the legislature. The phosphorus violations documented in 2025 and 2026, the ones the Friends of the Everglades report drew directly from the state's own data, are not a surprise to anyone who has been watching. Environmental groups have been tracking the gap between restoration promises and restoration performance for years. The gap is real. It is documented. And for the ecosystems on the other side of that gap, the sawgrass marshes, the tree islands, the shallow marl prairies, the mangrove estuaries, the coastal fisheries that millions of Floridians and tourists depend on for their livelihoods and their drinking water, the gap is measured not in policy terms but in species lost, water poisoned, and ecological functions that, once broken, take generations to restore. Days after Florida drained their wetlands, biologists discovered something terrifying. But the terror is not simply in what they found crawling through the mud or coiled in the tunnels or plastered to the dead vegetation in thousands of sticky pink clusters. The terror is in how long it had been building without being seen. The armored catfish had been burrowing for years. The pythons had been denning underground through seasons nobody tracked. The phosphorus had been accumulating in the sediment through decades of agricultural runoff that the treatment systems were never quite large enough to fully handle. The apple snails had been laying millions of eggs on every drawdown cycle, seeding the next generation of invasive colonizers into every corner of the marsh they could reach. South Florida has more non-native species than any other continental region in the world, and as researchers have documented, the wetlands where those species do the most damage are also the wetlands that represent the last functioning fragments of one of the most extraordinary ecosystems on Earth. Nutrient pollution, specifically phosphorus, flowing from the stormwater treatment wetlands into protected areas of the Everglades rose between 2024 and 2025, in some cases dramatically, even as official reports emphasize progress. Establishment of invasive Burmese pythons in the greater Everglades ecosystem has led to local precipitous declines of more than 90% of mesomammal populations, and conservatively, tens of thousands of invasive Burmese pythons are estimated to be present in the greater Everglades region. Florida is home to roughly 20% of all wetlands in the United States, and the invasive apple snail is actively degrading the health of those wetlands in ways that intersect with human health through parasites like rat lungworm. None of this is a secret. None of it is new. The data has been accumulating as steadily as the phosphorus in the sediment. What changes when you drain the wetland is simply visibility. The water goes away, and suddenly everything that was happening underneath it becomes real in a way that reports and monitoring data cannot quite convey. Real in the way that mud-covered armored catfish scraping across one another sounds like ceramic tiles shifting. Real in the way that thermal imaging returns heat signatures in tunnels you haven't opened yet. Real in a way that the ground gives way under your boot and you realize the marsh you thought you were standing on is hollow. The Everglades has survived a century of exploitation. It has demonstrated repeatedly in recovering zones and returning seed banks and recolonizing crayfish populations that it retains the biological memory of what it was meant to be. But survival is not the same as thriving, and documentation is not the same as action. The question is not whether the science exists to save it. The question is whether the decisions that need to be made about land, about funding, about agricultural runoff, about invasive species management, about the political courage to enforce the pollution limits that courts have already ordered will be made in time to matter. Because every day that water rises back over what the drainage revealed, the clock resets. The mud closes. The tunnels fill. The snails return to the vegetation. And everything that was briefly, terrifyingly visible disappears again beneath the surface of a wetland that still has so much it hasn't yet shown us.